Emma gripped the splintered edge of her wooden display table until her knuckles turned stark white. The heavy, sweet scent of her freshly baked blackberry pies filled the warm Texas air, completely ruined by the thick dust kicked up by the fairground crowd. Silas stood right in front of her booth, his thumbs tucked into his leather suspenders and a cruel, jagged smirk plastered across his face. Behind him, the mayor's two daughters covered their mouths with lace handkerchiefs, giggling loudly as they stared down at Emma's wide, full-figured hips. Silas stepped closer, his boots grinding a dropped piece of crust into the dirt, his eyes filled with malicious delight. With a sudden, violent sweep of his heavy arm, he smashed 3 of Emma's finest pies off the counter, sending the tin plates clattering into the mud. The dark purple filling splattered across the dry earth, instantly ruined and caked in filth. A loud, mocking laugh erupted from the gathering crowd, echoing brutally across the open town square. Silas leaned over the counter, his breath smelling of cheap whiskey, ensuring his venomous words carried to every single onlooker. "A fat cow like you needs to be sitting on a strict diet, not feeding honest folks with your heavy grease," Silas yelled out, pointing a dirty finger at her voluptuous frame. Emma felt the blood rush to her face, a deep, burning heat of pure humiliation piercing through her chest. She swallowed hard, trying to force down the sob rising in her throat, refusing to let them see her break completely. The mayor's daughters whispered loudly to each other, pointing at how the fabric of Emma's faded cotton dress strained tightly against her thick waist and wide shoulders. "Look at her. She probably eats half her stock before she even leaves her kitchen," one of the women shouted, prompting another wave of harsh, rhythmic jeers from the local merchants. Emma stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the ruined pies in the dirt, representing the last of her savings and 3 days of sleepless, exhausting labor. A single tear cut a clean path through the light dusting of flour on her flushed cheek, but she kept her chin up, enduring the public whipping. The cruel laughter reached a deafening peak as Silas raised his boot to crush the remaining loaf of her braided bread. Suddenly, the mocking noise was completely severed by the thunderous, heavy, rhythmic pounding of a massive horse approaching at a furious gallop. The crowd scrambled backward in blind panic as a giant, jet-black stallion surged into the square, its iron horseshoes tearing up the dirt. The rider pulled the reins with effortless, dominant strength, forcing the beast to halt exactly in front of Emma's battered booth. It was Caleb Vance, the most feared, reclusive, and powerful rancher in the entire territory. He sat high in his hand-tooled leather saddle, his broad shoulders casting a massive protective shadow over Emma's trembling form. His dark duster coat was covered in trail dust, and his face was a grim, unreadable mask of pure frontier iron. His piercing, slate-gray eyes scanned the mocking crowd, and the absolute silence that followed was heavy enough to suffocate the town. Silas instantly lost his smirk, his face turning a sickly shade of pale as he took 2 clumsy steps backward, his hands dropping to his sides. Caleb did not say a single word to the crowd. Instead, he swung his long leg over the saddle and dismounted with slow, deliberate grace. His heavy spurs jingled with a cold, metallic ring that made the mayor's daughters shrink back into the shadows of the general store. He walked past Silas as if the man were nothing but an annoying insect, stepping right up to the edge of Emma's ruined table. Caleb looked down at the shattered pies in the mud, then raised his eyes to look directly into Emma's tear-stained face. There was no judgment in his gaze, no disgust for her large, curvy body, only a deep, simmering gravity that demanded her absolute attention. He reached down with his large, gloved hand, picked up a clean, unbroken piece of the blackberry pie from a tilted tin, and placed it calmly in his mouth. He chewed slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, while the entire town square held its collective breath in stunned disbelief. Caleb wiped a stray drop of purple juice from his dark beard with the back of his hand, his expression unchanging. "This is the finest pastry in the entire state of Texas," Caleb announced, his deep, gravelly voice booming across the silent square like thunder. He reached into his heavy duster coat and pulled out a massive, bulging leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable weight of solid gold. He dropped the heavy pouch onto Emma's wooden table with a loud, definitive thud that made the wooden planks groan. "I am buying every single thing this woman bakes for the rest of her natural days," Caleb said, turning his fierce glare toward Silas. "The humiliation is officially over because Emma is leaving this pathetic town with me today as the true mistress of the Vance ranch." The crowd gasped in unison, and Silas looked as if he had been struck directly across the face with a heavy leather quirt. "Before we reveal the shocking words Caleb whispered into her ear that changed her life forever, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a single moment of this sweeping frontier romance." Caleb stepped even closer to Emma, the heat of his massive body shielding her completely from the staring eyes of the townsfolk. He leaned his head down, his lips almost touching the soft curve of her ear, his deep voice dropping to a low, intense rumble meant for her alone. "Pack your things, big girl, because nobody in this valley will ever make you feel small again." Emma felt her breath hitch in her throat as Caleb stepped back, his heavy hand resting naturally on the iron pommel of his holster. She looked down at the bulging leather pouch of gold, its sheer weight leaving a deep indentation in the soft pine wood of her table. Silas licked his dry lips, his eyes darting frantically between the gold and the terrifying silhouette of the territory's wealthiest rancher. "You can't just take her, Mr. Vance," Silas stammered, his voice cracking as he tried to find his lost bravado. "She owes money to the town market, and she's got a contract to supply the bakery by the end of the month," he lied, backing up another inch. Caleb turned his head slowly, his gray eyes narrowing into two slits of cold steel that made Silas instantly freeze in his tracks. "I just bought this valley's entire debt supply this morning, Silas," Caleb said, his voice deadly calm and dangerously quiet. "If she owes a single dime, she owes it to me, and I don't recall asking you to collect it for me." The mayor's daughters took another step back, their silk skirts rustling loudly against the wooden boardwalk as they abandoned Silas entirely. Emma felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth blooming in her chest, replacing the icy humiliation that had paralyzed her just moments before. She began gathering her small wooden rolling pins and her mother's faded recipe book, her hands still shaking but now driven by a sudden surge of adrenaline. Caleb stood like an immovable wall of stone, his broad back completely blocking the view of the staring gossips who still hovered near the livery stable. As Emma moved around the counter to pick up her fallen wicker basket, her foot slipped slightly on the slick, muddy crust of her ruined pie. Before she could lose her balance, Caleb's massive arm shot out, catching her firmly around her thick, voluptuous waist. His grip was incredibly strong, holding her large frame effortlessly against his side, his palm warm through the thin fabric of her cotton dress. Emma looked up into his rugged face, her heart hammering against her ribs as she felt the solid, unyielding muscle of his chest pressed against her shoulder. "Steady now," Caleb murmured, his voice softening just a fraction, though his eyes remained vigilant, scanning the perimeter of the square. She nodded silently, her face flushing a deep crimson as she realized he wasn't pulling away from her full, heavy curves. Instead, his large hand remained firmly anchored on her waist, guiding her gently toward a massive, covered supply wagon parked near the edge of the fairgrounds. The townsfolk parted like a flock of panicked sheep as Caleb led Emma through the dirt, his heavy boots leaving deep imprints in the mud. Whispers followed them like a foul breeze, bouncing off the wooden storefronts and the canvas tents of the annual market. "Look at the size of her. She'll break the springs on that fine wagon before they even cross the river," a bitter voice hissed from the safety of the saloon porch. Caleb stopped dead in his tracks, his large hand tightening around Emma's waist as he turned his gaze toward the crowded porch. The laughter stopped instantly, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence as several men quickly lowered their eyes and looked down at their boots. Emma squeezed her eyes shut for a brief second, the familiar sting of their words cutting deep into her soul, reminding her of years of isolation. Ever since she had blossomed into a full-figured woman, Oakhaven had treated her body as an open target for public mockery and cruel jokes. She spent her nights in a tiny, suffocating kitchen, baking until her back ached and her fingers bled, just to earn enough to buy flour for the next day. The local girls wore corset strings pulled so tight they could barely breathe, while Emma's natural heavy curves filled out her homemade dresses without any help. Silas had promised to marry her once, whispering sweet lies in the dark until he realized her father's farm was completely worthless and drowning in debt. The moment the bank foreclosed, Silas turned his back on her, joining the rest of the town in mocking the oversized baker girl who had nothing left to her name. Now she was leaving it all behind, packed into the front seat of a wealthy rancher's wagon with nothing but a basket of tools and a heart full of dread. Caleb helped her up onto the high wooden bench, his large hands anchoring under her thick arms, lifting her heavy weight with an ease that left her breathless. He climbed up beside her, grabbing the thick leather reins with his gloved hands and giving them a sharp, authoritative snap. The two massive draft horses moved forward instantly, pulling the heavy wagon out of the town square and away from the judgmental eyes of Oakhaven. Emma didn't look back as the wooden buildings faded into the distance, replaced by the vast, open, rolling hills of the Texas frontier. The silence between them stretched for miles, broken only by the rhythmic creaking of the wooden wheels and the steady thud of the horses' hooves. Emma stared down at her lap, her thick fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her apron, feeling acutely aware of how much space her body took up on the seat. "I know what they say about me, Mr. Vance," Emma said suddenly, her voice barely louder than a whisper against the passing wind. "You didn't have to throw your gold away just to save a girl like me from a bit of public shame." Caleb kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, his strong jaw tight as he navigated the bumpy dirt trail leading toward the distant mountains. "I don't throw my gold away on anything, Emma," Caleb replied, his deep voice vibrating through the wooden seat. "I bought those pies because they were worth it, and I brought you along because a woman with your fire doesn't belong in a cage full of rats." Emma looked at him, searching his rugged profile for any sign of mockery, but his face remained as serious and unyielding as a mountain crag. He turned his head slightly, his gray eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her pulse race. "You're a whole lot of woman, Emma, and out here on the frontier, that's exactly what keeps a home standing when the winter storms hit." The heavy wooden wagon rattled over a sharp ridge, and the distant, dusty rooftops of Oakhaven finally vanished behind the sun-scorched hills. Emma kept her hands tightly pressed into her lap, her mind still spinning from the sheer speed of everything that had just occurred. The vast, rugged prairie stretched out before them for miles, a beautiful but deadly expanse of dry brush, limestone boulders, and endless blue sky. Caleb steered the horses toward the northern pass, his large body moving in perfect sync with the jolting rhythm of the heavy transport. Every time the wagon dipped into a deep rut, Emma's shoulder brushed against his solid, muscular arm, sending a jolt of nervous energy down her spine. She felt incredibly large sitting next to him, acutely aware of the way her full thighs pressed firmly against the wooden bench and took up more than her fair share of space. In Oakhaven, the local dressmaker had always sighed with loud, dramatic irritation whenever Emma came in to buy extra yards of cheap cotton fabric. They had made her feel like a burden, an unnatural creature whose very existence was an offense to the delicate, frail standards of the town's elite. Caleb, however, didn't seem to mind the crowded seat at all. He sat comfortably, his long legs stretched out, completely at ease with her close physical presence. The afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the rugged Texas horizon in deep shades of bruised purple and burning orange. Suddenly, a sharp, panicked shout cut through the steady drone of the cicadas, echoing from a dry creek bed just ahead of them. Caleb's hands instantly tightened on the reins, his entire posture freezing into an attitude of intense, deadly alertness. "Whoa," he growled softly, pulling the horses to an immediate halt as his right hand instinctively dropped to the exposed grip of his Winchester rifle. Down in the rocky ravine, a heavy supply wagon from a neighboring homestead lay flipped completely over on its side, one of its rear wooden wheels shattered into splinters. A young boy, no older than 10, was pinned beneath the splintered pine sideboards of the heavy cargo bed, his face pale and covered in dark sweat. "Help, please," he cried out, his voice thin and cracking with terror as a small herd of loose, panicked cattle trampled the brush just a few yards away. The frightened steers were circling dangerously close to the wreckage, their sharp horns swinging wildly in the dust as they threatened to crush the boy entirely. Caleb didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the side of the seat before the wagon had even fully stopped, his boots hitting the rocky ground with a heavy thud. "Stay in the wagon, Emma," he ordered over his shoulder, his voice snapping like a pistol shot as he drew his sidearm to scare off the approaching herd. He fired a single round into the air, the deafening crack sending the panicked cattle scattering into the brush, but the heavy wagon bed remained a deadly trap. Caleb ran to the wreckage and shoved his broad shoulders under the splintered wooden frame, groaning loudly as he tried to lift the massive weight off the boy. The wood groaned under the pressure, but the wagon was fully loaded with heavy iron farming tools, making it impossible for one man to lift alone. Caleb's boots skidded in the loose dirt, his face turning a dark, dangerous crimson as the immense weight began to force him back down to his knees. Emma watched from the seat, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs as she saw the structural beam of the wagon begin to crack directly over the boy's chest. If that beam snapped, the entire weight of the iron cargo would come crashing down, crushing the child instantly before Caleb could pull him free. Abandoning all fear, Emma scrambled down from the high seat, her heavy skirts twisting around her ankles as she sprinted toward the ravine. She didn't care how clumsy she looked or how the rocky ground tore at the thin soles of her shoes. She only saw the desperation in Caleb's straining muscles. "I've got the other side," Emma shouted, her voice ringing out with an absolute fierce authority that made Caleb look up in startled surprise. She wedged her wide, strong shoulders directly under the rear axle of the overturned wagon, planting her feet firmly into the hard, unyielding Texas earth. She didn't have the fragile, useless arms of the mayor's daughters. Her body was built from years of lifting heavy flour sacks and kneeling before blistering ovens. Emma drew a deep, ragged breath, utilizing every ounce of the physical mass the townsfolk had spent years mocking to find her leverage. "Heave!" she cried out, her teeth bared as she pushed upward with the immense strength of her thick thighs and broad back. Together, their combined effort created a tremendous, powerful surge of force, lifting the heavy wooden frame a crucial 6 inches off the ground. "Now, son, crawl out," Caleb roared through clenched teeth, his arms shaking violently under the immense crushing pressure. The boy scrambled forward on his hands and knees, dragging his bruised legs out from beneath the shadow of the splintered timber just in time. The moment the child was clear, Emma and Caleb let go, and the massive wagon crashed back into the dirt with a deafening, earth-shattering boom. Emma stumbled backward, gasping for air as her lungs burned, her hands scraped raw and bleeding from the rough, splintered wood. Caleb ignored the wreckage entirely, dropping to his knees beside his young nephew Toby, who had been sent out to check the perimeter lines earlier that morning. He checked the boy's ribs with trembling but gentle hands, finding nothing but deep bruises and a few superficial cuts from the flying debris. "You're safe now, Toby," Caleb muttered, his voice thick with a rare, raw emotion as he pulled the shaking boy into a brief, tight embrace. Caleb stood up slowly, turning his gaze toward Emma, who was standing a few feet away, trying to smooth down her ruined, dirt-stained apron. His slate-gray eyes traveled over her disheveled hair, her flushed, sweat-slicked face, and the raw, bleeding palms of her large hands. There was a look in his eyes that Emma had never seen from any man before, a profound, unshakable respect that bordered on pure reverence. He walked over to her, his heavy steps deliberate, and gently took her injured hands into his own massive, calloused palms. "You didn't run, Emma," Caleb said, his deep voice vibrating with a quiet, intense power that made her entire body tremble. "Most women in that town would have screamed and fainted in the dirt, but you stood your ground like an iron pillar." Emma looked down at their joined hands, her heart swelling with a strange, overwhelming pride that completely washed away the lingering ghosts of Oakhaven. "I'm not built for fainting, Mr. Vance," she whispered, her voice steadying as she looked up into his rugged, unyielding face. Caleb squeezed her hands gently, his gaze locking onto hers with a fierce, possessive intensity that left no room for doubt. "No, you aren't," he murmured, a slow, grim smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. "You're built to survive, and you're exactly the woman this ranch has been waiting for." Caleb guided the heavy supply wagon through the massive, arched timber gates of the Vance territory, just as the final light of sunset dipped below the jagged horizon. The ranch was a spectacular, daunting fortress of stone and heavy cedar logs, built to withstand both the brutal elements and the lawless raids of the frontier. Dozens of sleek, powerful horses grazed in the nearby paddocks, their coats gleaming under the rising Texas moon as the wagon rolled to a stop outside the main house. Caleb climbed down from the seat and walked around to Emma's side, reaching up to wrap his large hands around her thick, voluptuous waist once more. He lifted her down with absolute care, his touch firm and deliberate as he held her against his solid chest for a lingering, quiet second before releasing her. "Follow me, Emma," Caleb said, his gravelly voice cutting through the cool evening air as he grabbed her small wicker basket and led the way up the wide stone steps. He pushed open the heavy oak door, revealing a massive, cavernous living area dominated by a roaring stone fireplace and deep leather furniture. The air inside smelled faintly of expensive tobacco, aged pine wood, and iron, a thoroughly masculine sanctuary that felt completely disconnected from the rest of the world. Emma stepped inside, her boots clicking softly on the polished hardwood floors as she looked around the immense, silent space in absolute awe. She felt incredibly small beneath the high, vaulted timber ceilings, yet acutely aware of how much physical presence she brought into this pristine, wealthy home. Caleb closed the heavy door behind them, throwing a thick iron bolt into place with a loud, definitive click that echoed through the room like a gunshot. "You're safe here, Emma," Caleb said, tossing her basket onto a nearby table and turning to face her, his broad shoulders blocking the entryway. "Nobody from Oakhaven sets foot on this land without my explicit permission, and none of them possess the courage to cross my fence lines anyway." Emma walked over to the massive hearth, the warmth of the fire instantly soothing the deep, aching exhaustion in her back and her sore, scraped hands. She looked down at her stained, torn dress, feeling a sudden, sharp pang of self-consciousness as she realized how ragged she looked in such a magnificent house. "I don't even know what I'm supposed to do here, Mr. Vance," Emma whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she turned back to look at him. "I'm a baker, and I'm a large woman who takes up too much room, but I don't know anything about running a grand place like this." Caleb walked over to her, his heavy spurs jingling softly with every slow, deliberate step, until he stood just inches away from her full, curvaceous frame. The heat radiating from his massive body was intoxicating, and Emma had to look up sharply just to meet the intense, unwavering focus of his gray eyes. "You don't need to change a single thing about yourself to belong here, Emma," Caleb said, his deep voice dropping to a low, commanding rumble. "I didn't bring you here to be a servant or a hidden cook who stays out of sight because the local fools don't appreciate her worth." He reached out, his large, rough thumb gently tracing the soft line of her jaw, his touch surprisingly tender for a man who commanded an entire valley with iron fists. "I brought you here because I want a woman with real substance, a woman whose beauty isn't hidden behind starvation and fragile lace," he murmured. Emma's breath hitched in her throat, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs as she felt the absolute sincerity in his heavy, masculine gaze. For years, men like Silas had made her feel like a grotesque mistake, a creature to be used for cheap labor and ridiculed in the bright light of day. Yet here stood the most powerful man in the territory, looking at her thick arms and wide hips as if she were the most precious treasure in Texas. "I have a proposition for you, Emma, and I want you to listen to me very carefully before you give me your answer," Caleb continued, his hand dropping to her shoulder. "Tomorrow morning, I am riding back into Oakhaven to settle every single matter regarding your old life, your debts, and the people who humiliated you. When I return, I want to stand before this entire valley and announce that you are my lawful, wedded wife and the absolute mistress of the Vance Empire." Emma gasped, her eyes widening in sheer shock as her mind struggled to process the staggering weight of his blunt, sudden proposal. You want to marry me?" she stammered, her voice cracking as she stared at his rugged, unyielding face. "A man like you could have any fragile, wealthy girl from the city, someone who knows how to play the piano and wear fine silk." Caleb let out a short, low growl, his grip tightening slightly on her shoulder as he stepped even closer, his chest pressing against her full bosom. "I don't want a fragile city doll who will break the first time the winter wind howls through the valley walls," Caleb said fiercely. "I want you, Emma, with all your strength, your beautiful curves, and the fire you showed when you saved my nephew today." He looked deep into her eyes, his expression grimmer and more determined than she had ever seen it before. "If you say yes, you will never have to count pennies for flour again, and no one will ever dare whisper a cruel word about your body within 50 miles of this river." Emma looked into his fierce, honest eyes and saw a future she had never dared to dream of. A life of absolute security, fierce protection, and genuine respect. She drew a deep, steady breath, her full chest rising and falling against his hands as she gave him her definitive answer. "Yes, Caleb," she whispered, using his Christian name for the very first time. "I will stay, and I will be your wife." Caleb nodded once, a look of grim satisfaction settling over his rugged features as he let his hand drop from her shoulder. "Get some rest, Emma," he said softly, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute finality. "Tomorrow, everything changes for you." The next morning, Emma woke up early to the sound of the heavy front door slamming shut and the distant, furious gallop of Caleb's black stallion. True to his word, Caleb rode straight into Oakhaven with a heavy iron lockbox strapped securely to the back of his saddle. He dismounted in front of the town market, his spurs jingling with a cold, metallic threat that brought the morning trading to an immediate standstill. Silas was standing near the boardwalk, tossing scraps to a stray dog, when Caleb's massive shadow fell across him like a physical blow. Silas turned around, his face instantly draining of color, as Caleb pulled out a stack of paper documents from his heavy duster coat. "I believe you mentioned Emma owed a debt to this market," Caleb said, his gravelly voice echoing off the wooden storefronts. Silas swallowed hard, nodding quickly as he tried to look behind Caleb for support from the gathering crowd. "She owes $40 for flour and sugar, Mr. Vance, and the bakery contract is worth another $50, Silas squeaked out. Caleb didn't say a word. Instead, he opened the iron lockbox, pulled out the exact amount in heavy gold coins, and slammed them into Silas's chest. "Every single debt held against Emma's name is paid in full, and I have just purchased the lease on this entire building from the bank," Caleb roared. "You and your wealthy backers are officially evicted from this market, Silas. So pack your things and get out of my sight before I throw you out myself." Silas looked down at the gold in shock, realizing in a single second that his petty greed had just cost him his entire livelihood and social standing. The mayor's daughters watched from across the street, their mouths hanging open in utter disbelief as Caleb turned his horse back toward the ranch. 2 days later, a grand, high-end traveling carriage arrived at the Vance territory, sent directly from the largest city in the state on Caleb's personal orders. A sharp, sophisticated tailor stepped out, carrying heavy rolls of expensive dark green silk, deep crimson velvet, and fine gold trim. Caleb stood by the grand stone fireplace, his arms crossed over his massive chest as he looked at the bewildered craftsman. "I don't want any of those thin, fragile dresses made for the city girls who starve themselves," Caleb commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. You weave these dresses to fit her natural, full figure, and you make sure every single curve on her body is celebrated with the finest fabric money can buy. Emma stood in the center of the large dressing room, her heart hammering against her ribs as the tailor carefully wrapped the rich fabrics around her heavy hips. For the first time in her life, she wasn't being told to squeeze into a smaller size or being judged for the wide expanse of her beautiful, voluptuous shoulders. The dark green silk flowed over her full thighs like liquid water, and the heavy velvet bodice hugged her thick waist perfectly, accentuating her breathtaking shape. When she finally stepped out into the main living area, Caleb stopped pacing entirely, his slate-gray eyes widening as he took in the sight of her. Emma felt a deep, warm flush creeping up her neck, her hands nervously smoothing down the expensive silk of her brand-new gown. Do I look all right, Caleb?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she stood before him in her full glory. Caleb walked over to her slowly, his heavy boots making no sound on the thick rugs as he stopped just inches away from her magnificent frame. He reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently cupping her chin, forcing her to look up into the intense, burning heat of his gaze. "You look like an absolute queen, Emma," Caleb murmured, his deep voice thick with a raw, primal devotion that made her pulse race. "Those fools in town wanted you to feel small because they couldn't handle a woman with your strength and beauty." He leaned down, his lips brushing against her forehead with a gentle, protective tenderness that completely erased the lingering pain of her past. "From this day forward, you hold your head high because you are a Vance, and you are the most beautiful sight in all of Texas." The peace of the Vance sanctuary did not last long, as the bitter sting of defeat drove the town elite to desperation. The next morning, the heavy rhythmic beat of multiple horses approaching the ranch house broke the quiet dawn. Emma stood near the kitchen window, her heart dropping as she saw Silas riding through the main gates, flanked by the town marshal and 3 armed men. They stopped their horses in a tight semicircle right before the stone porch, their rifles resting ominously across their saddles. Caleb stepped out of the front door before they could even call out, his Winchester rifle held loosely in his right hand. Emma moved right behind him, the rich, dark green silk of her new dress rustling softly against the hardwood floor as she refused to hide. "What brings you out to my land, Marshal?" Caleb asked, his deep voice carrying a cold, lethal edge that made the horses shift uneasily. Silas stepped forward, holding up a crumpled piece of parchment with a desperate, trembling hand. "We're here for the girl, Vance," Silas shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and malice. "She signed a prior 5-year labor contract with my family's estate before you paid off her market debts, and she belongs in Oakhaven." Emma gripped Caleb's shoulder, her fingers digging into his heavy leather duster coat as terror threatened to choke her. "That contract was forced on my father when he was dying. It's not valid," Emma cried out, her voice echoing across the courtyard. Silas smirked, looking up at her full figure with the same disgusting, patronizing gaze he had used at the fairgrounds. "The law is the law, you oversized thief, so climb down here before we drag you back to work off your true value," Silas yelled. Caleb didn't give them a second warning. His movement was a blur of pure, lethal frontier speed. He brought the Winchester up to his shoulder and fired a single, deafening shot that tore the parchment right out of Silas's hand. The bullet shattered the wooden saddle horn just inches from Silas's stomach, sending him tumbling off his horse into the dirt with a terrified shriek. The marshal's hand instantly froze over his holster as Caleb leveled the smoking barrel directly between his eyes. "Listen to me very carefully, every last one of you," Caleb roared, his voice shaking the timber beams of the porch. "Emma is my wife, and her only contract is to this ranch and to my name." He stepped down the stone stairs, his heavy boots pressing into the dirt as he stood over the groveling, terrified form of Silas. "If any man from that pathetic town ever looks at her again, or speaks a single word against her honor, I will bury him under this valley." The marshal slowly raised his hands, shaking his head as he backed his horse away from the clearing. "This isn't our fight, Silas," the marshal muttered, turning his mount around and abandoning the elite faction completely.
"Get off my land," Caleb growled, kicking dust directly into Silas's face as the broken man scrambled to find his horse. Silas mounted his horse in blind panic, fleeing back toward Oakhaven with his remaining men as the dust settled over the courtyard. Caleb turned back to Emma, his fierce gray eyes softening the moment they locked onto her voluptuous form. He walked up the stairs and wrapped his massive arms around her waist, pulling her thick, beautiful body tightly against his chest. "I told you before, Emma," Caleb whispered into her hair, his grip unyielding and completely protective. "Nobody touches what is mine, and you are the true queen of this valley now." 2 days after the confrontation in the courtyard, Caleb hosted a massive gathering at the Vance ranch, inviting every major landowner, cattle baron, and merchant from across the entire territory. Dozens of elegant carriages and fine horses lined the driveway, and the grand courtyard was illuminated by dozens of glowing lanterns that cast a warm, golden light over the stone estate. The remaining town snobs from Oakhaven, including the mayor and his daughters, had slunk into the gathering, terrified of what would happen to their businesses if they ignored Caleb Vance's personal summons. Emma stood inside the grand dressing room, looking at her reflection in the full-length mirror as she adjusted the heavy crimson velvet gown that the traveling tailor had meticulously crafted for her body. The rich, deep red fabric hugged her full, voluptuous hips and emphasized the breathtaking, generous curve of her waist, while the fine gold trim traced the elegant line of her broad shoulders. For the first time in her entire life, she did not see a woman who took up too much space. She saw a woman of immense power, grace, and undeniable, radiant beauty. Caleb walked into the room, dressed in a sharp, dark wool coat that made his massive frame look even more imposing, his slate-gray eyes instantly locking onto her silhouette. He stopped directly behind her, his large, rough hands coming to rest firmly on her wide, curvaceous hips, his touch sending a wave of absolute confidence through her veins. "You are the most beautiful sight in the entire state of Texas, Emma," Caleb murmured against her neck, his deep voice thick with an unshakable primal pride. "Let us go out there and show them exactly who rules this valley now." Emma placed her hand over his, her chin held high as Caleb led her out of the room and onto the grand wooden balcony overlooking the crowded banquet hall. The moment their boots hit the top of the stairs, the loud chatter of the wealthy guests died down into a sudden, breathless silence that gripped the entire room. The mayor's daughters stared up at Emma, their faces turning completely pale with envy and regret as they took in the sight of her expensive gown and her regal, commanding presence. Caleb stepped forward, his arm wrapped tightly and possessively around Emma's thick waist, drawing her large body flush against his side for everyone to see. "Listen to me, every single one of you," Caleb's gravelly voice boomed through the hall, echoing off the high timber ceilings like thunder. "This is Emma Vance, my lawful wedded wife, and from this second forward, she is the absolute, true mistress of the Vance Empire." He glared down at the remaining town elite, his eyes narrowing with a cold, definitive warning that made several merchants shift uncomfortably. Every contract, every shipment of beef, and every acre of land in this valley answers to her word, and any disrespect shown to her will be treated as a direct declaration of war against me. A profound silence filled the room before the wealthiest landowners in the territory stepped forward, bowing their heads in deep, genuine respect to the new queen of the valley. Emma looked down at the crowd, her heart swelling with an overwhelming sense of triumph as she realized the ghosts of her painful past were gone forever. She was no longer the rejected baker girl. She was loved, cherished, and fiercely protected by the most powerful man on the frontier. What do you think of Emma's spectacular transformation and Caleb's fierce loyalty? Would you have the courage to stand up against an entire town to protect the person you love? Let us know in the comments below.